The next person I'd love to invite up here is my dear friend Thupten Jinpa. Thupten Jinpa obtained his Geshe Lamram degree from Shartse College of Ganden Monastic University in South India. Jinpa also holds a BA in philosophy and a Ph.D. in religious studies both from Cambridge University. Jinpa has been the principal English translator to His Holiness the Dalai Lama since 1985 and has translated and edited numerous books by the Dalai Lama. He's also published multiple books himself, both in English and in the Tibetan language. Jinpa is an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Religious Studies at McGill University in Montreal. He's also a co-founder of CCARE, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford. And he's the main author of CCARE's Compassion Cultivation Training Program. Jinpa has been a core member of the Mind and Life Institute, dedicated to promoting dialogues between science and contemplative knowledge, especially Buddhism. And he's the founder and president of the Institute of Tibetan Classics and the general editor of the Library of Tibetan Classics. So, Jinpa, welcome.
It's a real joy for me to be part of this group, and particularly to have the honor to be part of this conversation, which is probably the largest gathering of science researchers in the field of compassion, at least to my knowledge. I've been to quite a few of them, but to my knowledge, this is probably the largest gathering of science researchers in the field of compassion science. And also the multidisciplinary nature of this particular gathering is very, very impressive. And for someone like myself who has been very interested in the understanding of compassion and its role in human development and so on, to see this kind of conference is very, very rewarding and fulfilling. So I would like to, at the beginning, thank Jim Doty for his vision and leadership in really making the dream of CCARE a reality. My own presentation is going to be from the Buddhist perspective, and I often, whenever I have the opportunity, try to remind my colleagues in the science world who are getting involved in this field that please remember that this is the field that we human beings have been very interested for a long time. In a sense, the scientists are the new kid on the block. And particularly when it comes to Buddhism, in some ways what makes Buddhism unique among the world's great spiritual traditions is that right from the beginning, Buddhism has been very interested in understanding human psychology. In some sense, Buddha can be seen as one of the earliest psychologists within the human world. And so it's not simply that the Buddhists are interested in trying to improve themselves and seek enlightenment, which is, of course, the ultimate goal, but they're also interested in trying to understand how do we get there and what are the mechanics of the processes involved in getting there. And in a sense, Buddhism shares with the Socratic kind of, motto that it is, in the end, knowledge that frees you. So, and knowledge of what? Knowledge of reality, particularly of the reality of our mental world, which in a sense is where we really live most of our life. In a sense, the world each of us live is a world that we create to a large extent. So understanding the workings of the mind, understanding the nature of the mind really becomes central to the Buddhist project of seeking that enlightenment. So my presentation will be from the Buddhist point of view, and and for those scientists, and this is one of the things that really has been remarkable about the enterprise of Mind and Life Institute, which is to really try to provide a forum where scientists and scholars doing research in these kind of fields can have an opportunity to engage deeply into perspectives coming from the contemplative traditions, and particularly from the Buddhist world. And when we engage with Buddhism, especially from the researchers of compassion, there are two areas where scientists can engage with Buddhism very deeply. One is the area of contemplative practice, particularly the kind of mental training we see with relation to training and cultivation of compassion. And we saw yesterday in Richie Davidson's keynote presentation the benefits of collaborating with contemplatives and contemplative scholars in developing, very creative and, clever design of experiments to try to understand what is going on when you put into fMRI an adept versus a novice. So that's one area of collaboration which can be very fruitful. The other area is, again, Buddhist tradition also has its own theoretical psychology, which is kind of equivalent to trying to do the basic science, a mapping of the mind. So there is a description of, understand and attempt to understand, processes like compassion at the basic level as a phenomenon. So these are two areas where there could be fruitful collaboration. So what I will do in my very brief presentation is first to talk about what is compassion. How does Buddhism understand compassion as a natural phenomenon? Then I will speak a little bit about what are the key salient points that emerges from trying to look at sort of a standard Buddhist compassion meditation, and what are the processes involved in this. And so then finally, I will end with some open questions as a sort of a basis for thought for researchers. So what is compassion? We had a wonderful treat from Paul Ekman, distilling the essence of his conversations with His Holiness. On the first day at the Compassion Festival, those who were there, Emiliana gave a wonderful presentation where she talked about the geography of compassion. Yesterday we had Richie Davidson speak about his understanding, and also Cliff presented a new model of compassion based on John Halifax's work. So now, basically, and now this is not taken from the literature that deals with the contemplative practice. This is part of what we call Buddhist Abhidhamma psychology, where it's an attempt to understand and describe the phenomena as a basic reality of our mind. So here, compassion, the Sanskrit word is karuna, nyingji Tibetan, is a mental state endowed with a sense of concern that focuses on another being and wishes for that being to be relieved of suffering. So this is a sort of a standard definition of compassion, and that emerges in the basic Buddhist description of what it is. Now, if you tease these out, you have an affective or an emotional component, which is a feeling of concern. A cognitive component, which is the perception of other suffering. And then third, there is the motivational component, which is the wishing to see that suffering be relieved. Now, I put up this next item, which is the kind of, I've taken out from what is emerging in the literature of the modern researchers on compassion. There seems to be a consensus on identifying three key elements. And if you look at them, they're very similar to what the traditional classical Buddhist description of what compassion is. Now, the only thing that I would kind of question is the third element in the description of the modern researchers, where the language is very kind of action-oriented. So acting to see acting to ease the suffering. So in the Buddhist description, it's less active. As a compassion, a simple wish to see that other person be relieved from suffering can be seen as a compassion. But then wanting to do something about this is seen as a more active form of compassion. So this active form of compassion, active element, need not necessarily be there to describe compassion. So this is where there is a little difference. And now you can see that the compassion is, according to this understanding, it's a sort of a multifaceted, complex process. It's not really a basic emotion, to use Paul Ekman's language. So you can see at least three different components that are identified. And so it is, in that sense, a multi-faceted process. And again, like not that dissimilar from the contemporary kind of psychology, emotion theorists, Buddhists also have a similar notion of the basic emotion versus the higher order emotions. So when we talk about mental processes, we also talk about the basic level and then the higher order level processes. So compassion, in a sense, belongs to these higher order level processes. And its basic reality is really seen as what we call tsewa, and which could be roughly translated as a sense of caring. So the basic reality of compassion is this sense of caring which we instinctively possess. And it manifests either in the form of a loving kindness, which is the wish to see that object of concern to be happy. So it's focusing on the joy side, happiness side. Or it can express in the form of compassion, which is a sense of concern, wishing to see that person be relieved from suffering. So at the fundamental level, the loving kindness and compassion are seen as emerging from the same basic state, which expresses differently whether it focuses on the other person's happiness or whether it focuses on the other person's suffering. So given that, Buddhists would argue that if they would be on the kind of the affective level, they would be different, there would be an element of distress, when you experience compassion, at least initially. Whereas when you experience metta or loving kindness to someone, there wouldn't be that element of distress. So there would be a different kind of valence in the experience of these two. But the basic reality is thought to be the same. Next, so one of the points I want to really make here is not so much to say which model is the right one, but really put on the table, multiple models, and this is the model that is coming from Buddhism, because my own sense is that, maybe many of the researchers may not agree, but I think that insofar as the scientific understanding of compassion is concerned, I don't think we have all the constructs in place right now. And I think it's an ongoing process and development. So therefore, to look at many different models of compassion is going to be helpful. So what compassion is not? From the Buddhist point of view, compassion is definitely not pity, because pity has an element of looking down, and which is rooted in some kind of sense of superiority. And in the technical Buddhist language, sometimes pity is referred to as the near enemy, because it looks like compassion, but it is actually not. Compassion is not attachment. Again, there is an explicit discussion of the distinction between compassion and attachment, because at the phenomenological level, an attachment to a loved one can also feel like a compassion for a loved one. So what distinguishes between the two? Now, the Buddhist argument is that in attachment, there will be a self-regarding consideration in that experience, whereas in compassion, there will be no, the focus will be just the other person. So that is the differentiating. So one is self-centered, the other one is other-centered. Now, the Buddhists would argue that compassion is not the same as the empathic feeling of others' pain. And this is where I would argue that as it stands, looking from the perspective of a philosopher and a Buddhist theorist, quite a lot of the literature that is coming out on compassion research, there seems to be a certain muddledness about confusion between empathy and compassion and altruism. So I think it's worth getting greater clarity, at least when it comes to our theoretical constructs. Now, from the Buddhist point of view, one of the strong aspects of compassion is the wish element, wanting to see the object of your concern be free from suffering. But it is not simply a positive wishful thinking. This kind of wish arises from a genuine sense of concern. So, and again, Buddhists would argue that true compassion is not conditional. It is an unconditional sense of, sort of wishing to see that other person be free of suffering. And then compassion is not self-regarding, which is sort of similar to what, this is the reason why, attachment and compassion are different. And I think it's helpful to look at these because in Buddhist philosophy, there is a tremendous emphasis placed on defining something not in positive terms of what the essence of that is, but in negative terms of what it is not. Now, I'll go very quickly through this because we will have Leah, my colleague from CCARE, who will be talking about in her presentation the key elements of CCT. So how much time do I have? Another 5? How much do I still have? Oh yeah, it's 9. Sorry, I have, yeah, because I heard a bell. So the key elements of a standard Buddhist practice, compassion and cultivation practice. So these are, I'm taking this from the Buddhist practice. This is not from CCT. So one of the key elements is cultivating deeper sensitivity to an understanding of the nature of suffering, especially its causal dynamics, first in relation to one's own experience. So in Buddhism, therefore, there's quite a lot of emphasis placed on, understanding, having a deeper understanding of the nature of suffering, not just in terms of acute pain, but also in terms of the psychological underpinnings and the kind of, distorted mental attitudes and habitual tendencies, patterns that give rise to pain and suffering and confusion and so on. So therefore, there's so much emphasis placed on, reflecting on other people's suffering, not just at the experiential level, but at the causal level as well. So therefore, to do Buddhist-style compassion training, it kind of presupposes you have some insight into the dynamics of thoughts and emotions, particularly in relation to yourself. Then you can then kind of extend that to others. Then another important element is to cultivate what in the Buddhist language we call equanimity, but this equanimity is a very difficult concept to really communicate in plain English. And it's also, often misunderstood. But here I'm using equanimity in a very specific sense of recognition of the fundamental equality of self and others, insofar as the basic disposition to wish for happiness and the wish to overcome suffering. And so trying to really, and this is similar to the idea of establishing shared common humanity, to recognize that just like me, the other person does not want to be in pain. Just like me, the other person wants to achieve happiness. So this trying to establish that kind of commonality at a very fundamental level, this is an important element of the training. Then another element is what is known as cultivating a perception of others as dear, as objects worthy of concern. Because as Paul Ekman in his typology showed us that familial compassion is very natural, instinctive. And familiar compassion may also be quite common. But when you move beyond that boundary, then it's very difficult to recognize someone else to be worthy of your concern. And here, again, part of the training is really cultivate this particular kind of perspective to holding others, worthy of your concern. And, again, this particular element, this particular construct is not really there in the current scientific conceptualization of what compassion is. It is it's not the same as empathy, and it's not the same as perception of others' suffering, and it's not the same as the motivational component. But in other words, what it seeks to do is to try to really establish a sense of identification with the object of your concern. And this is one of the reasons Buddhists would argue that the reason why we can feel such strong compassion for a total stranger who is in acute pain is because the experience of the pain is so powerful connector that we can identify with that person instinctively. But if the other person is not in acute pain, then of course it's harder, unless you're related, to really feel a sense of concern to that other person. And especially in some cases, we may, instead of feeling compassion, we may feel jealous, we may feel hostile, and so on. So this is why in the Buddhist conceptualization, in order to feel genuine compassion, you really need to have a way of identifying or making a connection with that object of concern. And then, so the last element, which is sort of the cultivating the perception of others as dear, this is a bit tricky one, because it's not really there at the moment in the modern scientific conceptualization and understanding of compassion and the processes that are part of it. Ritchie sort of hinted at this when he said antecedents of compassion. So if you look at the training, processes, there seems to be two things that are part of that cultivation. One is a deep sense of interconnectedness and identification with others on the basis of recognizing our shared nature, as well as the intertwining nature of self and others' well-being. One word is missing there, welfare. And the other one is, on this basis, developing a sense of gratitude and appreciation of others. So that to really point to us that the presence of others is not irrelevant to our well-being. The presence of others is, in some sense, intimately connected with our well-being. So these are two steps involved. And with that kind of thinking, then you can resonate with this is a quote from a Buddhist text, where you can see how these connections are conceptualized. There's a beautiful line which says, "In the field of equanimity, with the loving kindness as moisture, the seed of compassion grows into a tree of true altruism." So you can see the kind of the progression conceptualized in this beautiful metaphor of agriculture. And of course, the classical Buddhist ideas developed within the agricultural civilization of ancient India. So of course, many of the metaphor has to do with kind of agricultural life. But it is a beautiful, I personally find that passage very, very moving, actually. So I want, on this list, I've put a couple of things. It's like kind of a take home from the Buddhist understanding of compassion. So one is that the capacity to feel for others' suffering is inborn. So that seems to be, evolutionary theory, and the current psychology and Buddhism seems to converge on this. And this capacity is an essential aspect of our basic nature as sentient creatures. And in Buddhism, when we talk about sentient being is defined as a creature that is capable of experiencing pain. So the conceptualization of pain is a very important definition of sentient creature. And then the third point is that through cultivation, we can learn to feel compassion for a much wider circle of concern than we normally do in our natural setting. And Paul made that point very powerfully. And the heart of such cultivation practices must include developing sensitivity to others' suffering, a cognitive process that seeks to make one feel deeply connected with the wider circle of beings, and learning to wish to see them relieved of their suffering. So that's why we often use these phrases, "May all beings be free from suffering and its causes." So this is a sort of, in a sense, we are also trying to moisten our heart in a way so that these just doesn't become only an aspiration, but also part of our makeup. And then the highest form of compassion transcends all boundaries and embraces all sentient beings within its sphere of concern. And this is exactly what Darwin was talking about, and Buddhism has the same view. Now, I'll end with some open questions, and before that, again, since there's a very large gathering of researchers here, I would like to speak a little bit about the importance of getting the constructs right, and also the importance of not being dogmatically attached to the currently existing constructs, to have a sort of a working hypothesis kind of attitude to what we currently know. And Paul was very, very frank in pointing out where he did not know at least the answer to some of the specific questions. So I pointed out the third element of compassion, which was this acting to ease the other's suffering. Again, there, do we really need to bring acting to ease the other's suffering as part of the definition of compassion? Can we do with a weaker model where, Buddhism suggests, to have the wish to see the other person be relieved from suffering as a basic compassion, and then wanting to do something about it as a more active form of compassion? So that's another question. And then similarly, when it comes to altruism, at the moment there seems to be two main camps that define altruism differently. On the one side are psychologists and philosophers, as well as Buddhist contemplative scholars, for whom motivation seems to be an important defining feature of what is altruism and what is not. And if the motivation is completely other-regarding, and if the act involves some kind of cost to the person, then that is altruistic behavior, and it's altruism. Whereas if you look at the neuroeconomists and the evolutionary biologists and the zoologists, animal researchers, then they seem to define altruism purely independent of motivation. Of course, if you do, bring animals as well, then of course motivation becomes more complicated. But both sides are using the same term, and sometimes, even in one research paper, you see usage of the same term in two different ways. So again, that seems to be causing a fair bit of confusion. So I would like to really appeal to the scientists who are here to be more critically self-aware of your constructs that you are using as you do research and describe your findings. Now, and then also, do we have all the constructs there yet? I mean, that's another question. So I'll just list these questions here because I've run out of my time. I'll just, if, as Buddhism suggests, it is possible to cultivate compassion for all beings, how can we understand the phenomenon of compassion collapse? This is the point that, we're capable of feeling compassion towards few and concrete individuals. But beyond that, when the number gets big, it seems to collapse. So how do we explain that phenomenon? Does compassion arise always through the empathy route? And Paul Ekman was bringing that up. Or can compassion arise especially through cultivation without going through this route? Empathy here, I'm talking about the emotional resonance, which involves some element of distress. How might this question relate to the problem of compassion fatigue? Some scholars, including Buddhist scholars, argue there is no such thing as compassion fatigue. It is empathy fatigue. When compassion arises for another person or others, is it the case that one sense of self expands to include others within it? Or is it the case that one sense of self ceases within that state? Again, you can explain it in two different ways, and hopefully, researchers, especially neuroscientists, might be able to, resolve that question. And then another question, if compassion promotes a greater sense of well-being, is this because it provides a respite from self-focus? Or is there something intrinsically beneficial about caring for others? Again, we don't know. If it is simply a question of giving a respite from self-focus, one could see that function could be achieved through some other means. Can one phenomenologically and experimentally and neurally distinguish between pro-social behaviors motivated by attachment, by sense of duty, by sense of fairness, and by sense of compassion? So with that, I'll end. Thank you.